All right, well, welcome everyone. It's so great to see all of you. My name is Sarah Rathbun. If you don't already know me, I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at Dry Creek Vineyard. And we are just so excited today. This is the first time we've ever had our Old Vines in vertical, and I'm just really excited to hear what Tim has to say about it. Just want to go over a couple quick housekeeping things for you first. We're going to keep everybody on mute for the time being. Please use the chat feature down below. It's right next to the big button in the center, the big share screen button. There's a chat. I'll be watching that, so I'll make sure that if I see any questions, I'll be asking Tim those questions for you at kind of a good time, a good break for Tim. So go ahead and please use that. And again, just keep yourselves on mute if you don't mind, so we can kind of minimize any background noise. I'm just so happy to see all your faces right now. I'm just seeing so many familiar faces right now, and it's just so great to see all of you. We hope you're doing well, and this is just a really fun tasting that we're going to be doing for you today. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our winemaker, Tim Bell.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome, everyone. I'm really happy to see all of you, and so many of you. This is one of the best attended tastings we've had. This is really great. So we're going to take a deep dive into Old Vines Zinfandel today. And before we get started, I just wanted to talk to you briefly about what's going on right now in our world. And I've been out today sampling in some of our vineyards. We are looking at Sauvignon Blanc a lot right now because that's one of the earliest ripening varieties. And we had one vineyard where the owner called us and told us they had an unexpectedly high sugar. This is a vineyard that's usually not one of the first ones to ripen, so gave me a few heart palpitations there. But and we did go out and check it out today, and he was right on the sugar. But a lot of the other vineyards we checked out are not quite there yet. So I expect maybe late next week, sometime, and definitely early the following week or the last week of August, we're going to get rolling on Sauvignon Blanc, and probably some Zinfandel for Petit Zin Rosé will be coming in at that week as well, and maybe even some Zinfandel for red wine. So we'll see. But we've got, unfortunately, we're entering into a heat spell. And it's going to be, I see a lot of nods out there. It's going to be a little warm, and not always something we want to see as a winemaker. It reminds me of one of the vintages we're going to taste today, 2017, where we had a 5-day heat spell at the end of August, beginning of September, and that really sped things up for the vintage. So we'll see what happens. We could have a really, quick and fast start to the 2020 vintage here. So I wanted to talk about just about making Zinfandel as a wine in general a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about Old Vine in particular. So Zinfandel is a, well, first of all, a lot of Pinot Noir winemakers say, oh, Pinot is so hard to make, and everybody else has it easy, and, us Zinfandel winemakers are just, they're going, because Zinfandel is also quite a difficult grape to work with. And one of the things about Zinfandel is it's notoriously uneven ripening. And that's within each bunch. You will have sometimes some fruit that is, overripe and starting to shrivel, some other fruit that is, just right, and other berries that are, still kind of pale. And Sarah just put up a photograph here where this is not a fully colored bunch. This was I believe, earlier this year, just a few weeks ago. But you can see already, early on in the process of coloring up, that there's considerable variation there. We've got some fully green berries, some pretty dark colored berries, and some somewhere in between. And that's Zinfandel. And so really the trick is, as a winemaker, in deciding when to pick, is knowing, when you kind of feel like you've got that good average of within each bunch, of getting some really delicious grapes for some nice wine. And when I talked about some of those grapes tend to shrivel. So you can't avoid that with Zinfandel. You're always going to have a few sort of raisiny looking grapes in every bunch. Even in this photo that we've got up right now, if you look kind of on the well, it's on my right. I think it'd be on your right too. In the center, there's kind of this little shriveled up grape in there already. And just last week, I was out front in our DCV2 vineyard in front of the winery and seeing a few that were starting to pucker up a little bit. And what that happens is when it does that is it really concentrates the sugar. And so one of the things that's important when we make Zinfandel is that we do a 3-day cold soak. So we destem the fruit into a tank, and we set the temperature down to around 50, 52 degrees, and just keep it nice and cool for 3 days. And we might do a little bit of mixing of the tank, but it pretty much is just hanging out there. And the reason for that, one of the big reasons is for Zinfandel is that you get that slow release of sugar from those shriveled grapes. So it doesn't come out all at once. So if I check it the day I crush it, and then I check it 3 days later, I'm going to have a higher sugar. And that's just the way it is with Zinfandel. And so the reason we really want to have a better idea of that real sugar is that it helps us decide how much yeast we're going to add to a tank. And it really helps us guide us in the nutrition that the yeast are going to need. So not only do we use the yeast, but we add some nice nutrients. It's basically yeast that have died and released. They're broken down. Their cell walls open, and they're very high source of nutrition. I know my daughter likes to eat nutritional yeast as a vegetarian, and yeast can benefit from that as well. So we'll add some of that to the tank and sort of feed it in slowly over time, a few additions during the fermentation, so they don't eat all their growing food at once. That's being a good parent for the yeast. The other thing about making Zinfandel, like Pinot Noir, is a little bit color challenged. It tends to be a little bit on the lighter side. It is one of the reasons that we do blend it with other varieties like Petit Syrah, for example, which is very dark colored. But the other thing we do here, and I'm going to ask Sarah to put up a photograph when she can, is we add a bunch of dry ice to most of our Zinfandel tanks. And here's a photograph here. This is Brian, our assistant winemaker, dumping some fruit. And you see kind of that mist rising up from the bottom of the photograph. That's a bunch of dry ice in that bin where we're going to ferment, bubbling away. And this was a technique that I learned from some Pinot Noir winemakers. They felt like they got better color out of the grapes when they used dry ice. And so I played around with that a number of years ago, and it does take quite a bit of dry ice, but I did feel like I really was seeing at the end of the cold soak some really nice color. And more recently, within the last few years, I heard a professor from Washington State University talking about the dry ice technique, and sort of confirming what I was speculating was happening. And what that is you've got all your color in the cell walls of the grapes, because the juice itself is pretty clear. So that's why we ferment with the skins. So we extract the color out of the skins. And so you've got pigment that's locked in all those cell walls. And if we put dry ice in there, we may be actually freezing the contents of some of those cell walls, which is largely water. It's mostly water. And as you know from when you freeze something at home, water expands when it's frozen. So that frozen water may actually sort of burst open those cell walls of the grapes a little bit and release some of the beautiful pigments into the juice and give us a more deeply colored wine. So that's one of the other little tricks that we use with Zinfandel as well. And so, okay, we've got Zinfandel, but what's so special about old vine Zinfandel? Well, one thing is those vineyards are just really cool. Those vines just become kind of living sculptures. And I remember working a few years ago with a vineyard manager who got really excited about this old vine vineyard we were looking at. And he'd say, years ago, people were, working this vineyard with horses and plows, and we're still here working the same vines today. And that's really kind of an amazing thing. One of the benefits of older vines is you get less fruit. They do produce less fruit, but it is a little bit more concentrated. We get a little bit deeper, richer wines out of that. The other thing is that a lot of these old vineyards are planted as field blends. So what we mean by that is it is primarily Zinfandel, but there are other grape varieties mixed in there with it. And so there's a lot of different things you'll find in there, sometimes some Alicante Boucher. We've got some vineyards like Beeson Ranch and Bogenson that definitely have some Petit Syrah mixed in with the Zinfandel. And there's other varieties as well. This is a photo that I asked Sarah to take. And so from left to right, we've got Alicante Boucher, and that's got the big round berries. And it's actually it's one of the most darkly colored grapes and wine. It makes one of the most darkly colored wines you can. We have a little bit of this out in front of the winery, which is really fun to play with, but it also is a part of some of these great old vineyards. And it's an unusual grape in that the juice itself is colored as well as the skins having pigment. So it's just really a deep, dark wine. And it has this really beautiful sort of black pepper quality along with some nice fruit that I really like. So it adds some nice spice. In the middle of the photograph is Zinfandel, and you can see, yep, it's kind of unevenly ripened there. You've got some pale berries and some fully dark berries there. And then on the right side is Petit Syrah. So it's not too different looking from Zinfandel. They're both can be fairly tight clusters. Petit Syrah can even be tighter, so the berries are really kind of pushed together tightly in the cluster. But Petit Syrah has so much more color than Zinfandel and a lot more tannin too. So it adds a lot of richness and depth to the wine, adds the color, and what we would call structure. So that tannin is that when you get a really young wine that's high in tannin, it gives you a little bit of a cottony, dry feeling on your tongue. That's what tannin is, but it's also an antioxidant that helps the wine age. And so we want the right amount of that. We want the wine, and it adds some body. If it doesn't have enough, the wine feels kind of flabby. So all of these work together, and other varieties to make great Zinfandel. Some of the other varieties you might find in these field blend vineyards might be some Carignan, some Mourvedre, and Grenache. There's a whole bunch of different varieties. And so what's also cool about that is we just pick that all together at once. So each variety is probably a little bit different in ripeness when we pick it. It's got a little bit different flavors, and each vineyard then has its own unique mix depending on how many vines of other varieties they added in. So each vineyard really has its own personality in a very distinctive way. And that just makes some really interesting and unique wines for Old Vine Zinfandel. And I wanted to mention too that Dry Creek Vineyard is the first winery to ever use the term Old Vine on the label. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. But no, it was back in the mid-'80s, our long-term employee, Gary Emmerich, who we affectionately call the inventory Nazi, we came up with that term when they were kicking around an idea for a blend. And this is that label here. So when I saw this label today before we were preparing, and one thing you'll notice if you look closely is there's no vintage. It was actually a blend of two different vintages, the very first Old Vine Zinfandel that we made. But also I was interested in the mix of Zinfandel and Petit Syrah. So this is 75% Zin and 25% Petit Syrah. Typically in our Old Vine Zin, I like to use somewhere between maybe 18, 19% Petit Syrah at the low end, up to maybe 20 or 21. So I always kind of felt like, oh, maybe I'm using kind of a high percentage of Petit Syrah there, but I really like how the wines come out. And then to see this, that the very first Old Vine was pretty much in line with that, used even more Petit Syrah than I typically do, made me feel like, okay, I'm following tradition here. So it's a good thing. We're going to embrace that and love it. The last thing, before we start talking about the wines, is just to tell you that I know I work for Dry Creek Vineyard, and you'll say I have to say this, but it's true that Dry Creek Valley is the best place for growing Zinfandel. I've worked with Zinfandel from Napa Valley and from other parts of Sonoma, and they all have some really beautiful Zinfandel, and even Russian River Valley has some beautiful vineyards. But I just think that Dry Creek Valley, for me, has just the right combination of warmth and cool weather in the evening to really bring out some extra spice in Zinfandel that is rare in other regions. So we get not only beautiful sort of boysenberry, black cherry fruit, but a lot of nice kind of spice character, and sometimes we call it sort of briar patch, where you're kind of, imagining you're out picking berries and you've got, the beautiful ripe aromas of berries and a little bit of that vegetal quality from the shrubbery there too. It's all part of the mix of Zinfandel aromas and flavors. And it's one of the things we really love. So if you take nothing else away from this today, Dry Creek Valley is the place for Zinfandel. And of course, Dry Creek Vineyard is the winery for Zinfandel. So, I talked about how Zinfandel often, will have this uneven ripeness within a bunch, and you have a little bit of raisins, you have some underripe fruit. For me, the key is to look at picking the fruit when we've got fresh flavors going, and it's not going too far into the raisiny side of things, because we really want beautiful fresh fruit flavors, and that really is a hallmark of our style. If the more shrivel and concentrated sugar you get, the higher sugar you end up with in the juice, and that leads to higher alcohol in the wine. So we really, on the spectrum of Zinfandel ripeness, are kind of at the lower end, and I really like it that way. We have plenty of bold, beautiful flavor, but there's some freshness to it that, and the wine isn't too alcoholic and doesn't lose its acidity too much by being too ripe, so it really can age well. And so let's test that a little bit. We've got some fairly recent vintages here, but you can't see it, but in front of me I've got 3 glasses of our Old Vine Zinfandel, and I think we're ready to start tasting. Are you guys ready?
So Tim, I want to ask you, as a winemaker, do you start from 2016 or do you start at 2018, and why?
That is a good question. So I usually start with the older wines. And the reason is if you start with the younger wines and head backwards, I find that you start with this point of reference of very young wine, and then as you get to older wines, they start to seem maybe a little too mature, but it's kind of just by comparison. These are relatively young vintages, so I would encourage you at some point here to kind of go back and forth between them and really pick out the differences. But yeah, I just like to start at that older end, so that we can really appreciate the older wine for what it is, and then move on up to the younger vintages. And I don't know if there's some corollary there with aging, but you guys will figure that out, right?
Perfect. Well, and then while you're swirling your glass and while everybody's starting to sniff, Rich was getting extra credit here and read the label that we just put up and said that, that the winery is established in 1972, which hopefully everyone knows at this point, but the first bottling of Old Vine Zin was in 1987. And he was asking did it take 15 years for the first bottling? And I think it was just that was the first time that we had put Old Vine Zin on the label as opposed to just Zinfandel. So I just wanted to answer his question there.
That's right. We've pretty much been making Zinfandel from the very beginning, and I believe that one of the key vineyards early in our winery's history was actually an Old Vine vineyard, but it just wasn't really a thing that people were calling out on labels. But now it is. So let's, hopefully, I see some of you there. I've got 3 bottles lined up. That's really cool. You've got the 3 different vintages. So 2016, let's start with that. Yeah, to me, I get some really beautiful ripe boysenberry, some nice touch of spice, like maybe cumin and coriander.
Nice.
And let's give it a taste. Yeah, to me, this wine is just really beautiful texture, very silky and smooth. The tannins that we were talking about are not standing out. They're very kind of smooth and integrated. So, there's a lot of the vineyards in these 3 wines. They have some vineyards in common, although certain vineyards in certain years are higher percentage or lower percentage. So let's talk about a little bit of what happened in 2016. So first of all, in terms of the weather, it was a pretty moderate growing season. There was a little heat spell, I think somewhere in September, later in the vintage. We typically start picking Zinfandel, near the end of August, and then get through most of it, pretty much all of it in September for the most part. So anyhow, 2016, very nice weather overall, and this wine, I think, has really nice richness and weight, and really balanced. I've got some notes here in front of me that I wanted to share with you too. So a lot of you know our Beeson Ranch vineyard, which is a single vineyard bottling of a really wonderful old vine vineyard. And Beeson is the biggest proportion of this 2016 blend. And right next to it, in number 2 place, is a small vineyard called Kowalski. I always told people it was kind of farmed under sort of benign neglect philosophy of farming. They did very little, but these vines just seemed to sort of regulate themselves and make some really beautiful wine. It wasn't the darkest, richest Zinfandel, but really spicy and interesting, a lot of complexity there. And then another big contributor to this, which you're going to hear about in subsequent vintages more, is a vineyard called Buchignani. And this is farmed by multi-generation family at the north end of the valley, which is the warmer area of Dry Creek Valley, and just beautiful old vine Zinfandel again there. They have some right next to Dry Creek Road and some up on a higher elevation on a hill. Really gives me a workout when I get up there, but it's such a beautiful vineyard too. You get to see trees all around and, sometimes hawks and flying around. It's a really beautiful spot. So this vintage 2016, we started our picking on August 31st and ended on September 28th. So almost, a whole month of picking for Zinfandel there. And the blend is 78% Zinfandel. And I always say the Zinfandel's in quotes, right? Because you remember the field blend thing. We call it all Zinfandel, but we know that there's some other grapes mixed in there that aren't. We use 19% Petit Syrah, and then 3% Carignan, which was one of the higher percentages of Carignan we've had in a number of years. And I did want to talk briefly about that. The Carignan that we got is in this blend is an old vine vineyard as well, and it's owned by the Gobar family, kind of the north east part of the valley, and it was really unusual to find some old vine Carignan. It was planted in 1904, and I found that back in 2013 when I was looking for old vine Zin. And so we get a little bit of both from them, some old vine Zinfandel and that Carignan. And Carignan has traditionally always been a variety that has been planted and blended with Zinfandel. Sometimes secretly blended with Zinfandel. Growers would say sometimes that they throw the Carignan at the bottom of the bin and cover it with Zinfandel and hope the winery wouldn't notice. But the Carignan, I thought that was just a really cool thing. So it adds some really nice texture and beautiful pure fruit. It doesn't really have the spiciness of Zinfandel, but some really nice fruit. So we also did on these lots, we'll leave them on skins for a certain period of time, all the Zinfandel and Petit Syrah, until we get just the right amount of tannin, actually. So you get color pretty quickly up front, and then you kind of start building up tannin. And so that's what we're really monitoring daily during the fermentation. And in 2016, we kept the fruit on the skins anywhere from 10 days to 16 days, which was kind of a little bit longer than we typically would do. I don't want to get too much tannin built up there. So, but this happened to be, like I said, a kind of very nice vintage, and we could let it hang out on the skins a little bit. And it's 27% new oak in this as well. So we typically use right around that, at the low end 25 to the upper end maybe 30% new oak. And I really like that oak to be a nice spice or ingredient, like kind of a flavor, and not a dominant piece of the flavor profile of the wine. And when I taste this 2016, I don't taste any oak. It's just this really beautiful integrated kind of array of flavors. So I really like it. I don't know if thumbs up or thumbs down from everybody out there who's had it. I don't want to see the thumbs down. So.
I know, I'll turn their video off if they have thumbs down. David Wallace was wondering, where does the Petit Syrah come from?
That's a good question. So we do have, in the 2016 vintage, we had a vineyard called Raffinelli, where we did get some of the Petit Syrah, and then also Beeson Ranch has a block of just pure Petit Syrah, in addition to a few vines mixed in with the Zinfandel. So we also use some of that Petit Syrah in the 2016 as well, and typically use it every year in our old vine Zinfandel. It's kind of a major source of Petit Syrah for that wine. Okay, so next wine is the 2017 Old Vine. And let's give that a taste if you have it. And if you don't, taste what you got, okay? So for me, I noticed right away in the nose a little bit different aroma profile. You know, to me, that there's a little bit of a little bit touch of oak that is still standing out a little bit and maybe not quite as integrated as the 2016. But some really nice fruit, some kind of like boysenberry, raspberry, and I get, you know, a little bit of spice, maybe a little bit like white pepper. And for me, this also has a very nice smooth texture, but there is a little bit more slight edge of tan in there, which you might expect in a younger wine. But I think it's also a factor of the vintage. And it has a very sort of nice ripe flavor. So 2017 was a year that a lot of us in this area will never forget. But for one thing, at the end of August, for like 3 days, and then the first 2 days of September, we had a heat spell where we're hitting high 90s, and I think we might have hit 100 degrees once, maybe even twice. But so like I talked about at the beginning of this tasting, that really kick-started the vintage, made it go fast. We had to bring on a lot of fruit very quickly. We didn't want a lot of that shrivel happening. But inevitably, that led to a little bit more dehydration in this vintage, and that means the juice was more concentrated, so a little bit darker color, a little bit more richness, and you get maybe even just a little bit more structure. So it's just kind of maybe a slightly bigger style of wine, and really drinking nicely now. When I looked at the harvest dates too, it was very close to 2016. We started on August 31st, the same date. We ended a little bit earlier, September 23rd, so it was, you could see, a little bit more compressed there in the harvest. And in terms of how much time we spent on the skins, that was also shorter. You know, probably about 12 days was the longest that any of those Zinfandels spent on their skins in the fermenter. And in this vintage, the Bucagnani vineyard that I mentioned with the 2016 was by far the largest percentage. It was around 30% of this blend. And then taking number two was a vineyard I haven't mentioned yet, but it's Forchini. And I don't know if you're getting the idea, but there's you know, sometimes a lot of Italian names attached to a lot of these vineyards. You know, we've got just down the road from us also the Saini family with a lot of Old Vine Zinfandel as well. So yeah, the Forchini vineyard, this is on the eastern bench of Dry Creek Valley. It's just a little bit north of here, a few miles, and a really meticulously farmed vineyard. Andrew Forchini is a man of the soil. He will get down in there and dig in the soil and show me, hey, because this is a dry farm vineyard. I'll say, hey, look, there's still moisture down there. We're okay. We're gonna be okay with these vines, and really takes great care of these vines. So it's really nice to see when he can be a significant part of the blend. And then the blend is 76% Zinfandel, it's 22% Petit Syrah, and 2% Carignan. And it was 28% New Oak in this vintage.
So Tim, we have a couple of questions. One was that you had mentioned Raffinelli as a vineyard. And so someone had asked, Patrick was asking, is Raffinelli the winemaker, or is the vineyard owned by the Raffinelli family?
Yes, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the Raffinelli winery. They both have a vineyard and a grower. This Petit Syrah was actually a brother of Dave Raffinelli, who is kind of the current patriarch of the Raffinelli family. So it's Doug Raffinelli, and he's not a part of the winery, but he is a grower. So two different brothers here in the valley growing a lot of great fruit here, and it was some really nice Petit Syrah. Yeah.
So Bruce was asking, are there any Old Vine Petit Syrah vineyards in Dry Creek?
You know, I haven't, there may be, but I haven't encountered any that are basically pure Petit Syrah. And I don't know why. I do think that the Old Vine Zinfandel vineyards that are field blends, you know, they typically probably were used to a little bit more lighter style of wine than we are. A lot of these people came from Europe, and typically didn't have as quite a big, bold, rich wines. And in fact, a lot of the, I didn't mention this, but a lot of these old vine vineyards, you'll find a few white grapes mixed in there as well. Beeson Ranch is a good example. There's a few vines of Trousseau Gris. It's kind of an obscure white variety, but people sometimes refer to that mix of red fruit and white fruit in a vineyard as a salt and pepper vineyard. I've got a little salt and pepper myself, so I like that. And anyhow, it is in the tradition of European winemaking sometimes to put a little bit of white grapes in with some of the reds, and you get maybe a little bit lighter color and texture, and that's just kind of a stylistic preference. So, but it's a long way of coming back to saying I don't know of any old vine Zinfandel, but if you find some out there, I'd really like to know about it.
So David Barson was wondering, as far as the temperature goes, does the Dry Creek Valley cool off more than Alexander Valley, or which one stays warmer at night?
I haven't spent a lot of time sort of looking at weather data, but I really think that is true. Partly because Alexander Valley is more east of us, so just the further inland you get from the ocean, you're going to tend to be warmer overall temperatures. And just the time I've spent in Alexander Valley, it just tends to be a warmer place. So, Dry Creek Valley is a lot more narrow. It's only about 2 miles wide. Alexander Valley is a lot broader. I don't know how many miles that is. And I really feel like our valley, it's kind of this long, narrow shape. It's about 16 miles long, and it really acts almost like sort of a funnel. It kind of brings in some nice cool air from the south in the evening. So, we open up at the south end, basically to Healdsburg, which is kind of lies at the conjunction of 3 different great grape growing areas. You've got Alexander Valley, Dry Creek Valley, and then south end is Russian River Valley. And so we really open up to the Russian River Valley, which basically kind of, down as you get down towards Santa Rosa, there's kind of a broad historic floodplain. A lot of streams run through there. And so it really brings in this nice cool air at night off the San Francisco Bay up into our region. And you can even see that if you see some nice satellite photographs that we unfortunately don't have to show you here today, but it's a really cool time-lapse thing where you see the fog move in at night and then move back out. And so I think we get a little bit cooler, and I think I'm just going to say that's why we make better Zinfandel. Yeah, so good question.
Great, and there's one more from Eleanor that I want to make sure we get to before we go to the next vintage, though I see the other questions, so don't worry, I'm getting my way around to them. But Eleanor noticed that you're talking a lot about our long-term growing partners and not necessarily our own vineyards. So maybe you just touch on kind of our Zinfandel program and what we have, and then what we look for in our long-term growing partners.
Yeah, so our winery has, as we mentioned earlier, was founded in 1972. So we're coming up in just a few years on our 50th anniversary. But we tend to, we want the old vine term to mean something. It's not officially defined or regulated term, but we want our vineyards that go into this blend to be at least 50 years of age, if not older. And many of them are. Most of them were planted over 100 years old, but 100 years ago, I should say. But sorry, I lost the grower partners versus our own vineyards.
Yeah, are they our own grapes? Do we use our own grapes? Why are we using so many partners' grapes in this particular blend?
So our vineyards are not old enough to really qualify as old vine by our standards yet, but they'll get there. What we do have is some real, we have this really great, all these estate vineyards that are part of our Heritage Vines Zinfandel program. So if you've tasted that wine, that has significant contributions from estate vineyards. These vineyards were planted, the most recent one is back in 1994 up to, late 90s. So, they're not young vineyards. They're fully mature vineyards. And some really unique selection. Those were actually planted with a selection of Zinfandel, which came from an old vine vineyard. It was a vineyard called Mazzoni. And so, the idea was to get some of that really great old vine character in these younger vineyards. But, like I said, we're not there yet. And I know, originally when we started in 1972, if we had planted some Zinfandel right away, we would have, we'd have some old vines in now. But David Starrer was, really inspired by the white wines of the Loire Valley. So he planted Sauvignon Blanc and later some Chenin Blanc. And, you know, he knew that Zinfandel had a good reputation here, but he didn't plant it right away. So it took us a little while to get around to doing that ourselves.
So I'm going to jump in real quick and just share my screen too, just for some photos for context of what these actual old vines look like, how old these vines really are.
Yeah, this is a photograph from Beeson Ranch, and this is, you know, the vines right after it's been pruned, so no growth yet. You kind of see what it looks like before all the shoots and the fruit are on the vine. And you can even see there, you know, this vine had a little surgery. You can see kind of at the left there that someone cut off part of an arm. Sometimes you have to do that to sort of get a new position for the buds that you leave behind to, you know, be in a better spot. This photograph I really love. So look at the trunk of this vine. I mean, it's so thick. It's so kind of gnarly and it's got nooks and crevices and crannies. And one of the vineyard managers I worked with, the same one who was getting really excited about working with old vine vineyards, told me that the living tissue on these vines is really more around the outside of the vine. And a lot of times that interior tissue that's no longer alive may get eaten out by termites. And sometimes you can't really, you can't really see it in this photograph. Sometimes you can actually look through the trunk of these vines that actually get sort of hollowed out and look all the way through. And it's just amazing that you look at that and think, oh, that's got to hurt the vine. It can't still be alive, but they're doing just fine and covered with moss and everything. So it's a really cool living sculpture there. You know, this is a really good example of sometimes, this to me looks like a vine that sort of leaned over or got hit by a tractor or some equipment, and they kept growing one side, and then they trained up, you know, maybe some a new shoot from the other side and got some new positions where they you know, could make a complete vine. It's kind of split in two. So yeah, some really cool stuff in these old vineyards, and it's a lot of fun to spend some time. I feel really privileged to get to spend some time walking around these vineyards and just enjoying just some amazing land and scenery along with the beautiful fruit.
Great. Well, these people all look very thirsty. No one is drinking. So let's get on to the 2018 vintage if you're ready.
2018, yeah, I'm ready. So if you've got the three vintages, if you're lucky enough to have those in front of you, I think you'll notice more youthful fruit. It's just, you know, a function of this being a younger wine. Some really nice sort of boysenberry, cranberry, you know, maybe not quite the same on the aromatics, same sort of dark fruit, but some really, really nice fruit there too. And I'd say that this is very approachable now. I do get a little bit of dryness in the tannin at the end of the wine, but some really nice elegance. 2018 vintage was one of two kind of cooler vintages. So both 2018 and 2019 were a little cooler overall. That led to a nice even pace of ripening. And so you could really kind of cherry pick vineyards when you really wanted to pick. And it was a later start too. So I mentioned the first two vintages we tasted started on August 31st. This pick didn't start until September 8th. So, you know, if you get up 7-8 days later, that's can be fairly significant, because when you're getting close to ripeness, you know, things can move very quickly. And it didn't end in the picking for this 2018 didn't end until near the end of September. We did have some very long maceration time, some 17-day maceration on one of the lots. So that's, again, kind of a significant sign that we probably weren't getting a lot of tannin from some of these lots, and we could kind of leave them on there and see if we got, you know, some additional complexity or a little maturity that from sitting on the skins. I mentioned earlier the Kowalski vineyard. The 2018 is actually the last vintage for that vineyard. The owner just decided to stop farming, couldn't really afford it, unfortunately. So it's a sad thing, but no more Kowalski, unfortunately. But again, the lead vineyard in this was the Buchignani vineyard, and around 33%, so quite a bit. And once again, Forchini was number 2 in the percentages for this blend. The blend itself is 80% Zinfandel and 19% Petit Syrah, and then just 1% Carignan this year. So, like I said, it was a cooler vintage, kind of a nice balanced wine. And a lot of times these vintages where the wines aren't, super ripe or big, the wine is probably going to age pretty nicely. I think this has a good chance of being a wine that will age very well. And I know Sarah sent me a question that someone out there sent before the tasting, talking about, Zinfandel as a drink now kind of wine. And I've got it here. It was from Carol. But, some people Carol was saying, are suggesting Zinfandels could be cellared. And I think that's absolutely true. We're fortunate here that we have this 50-year library of wines and we can taste older vintages. And I can tell you that Zinfandel can certainly age very well. When it gets very old, maybe you were talking like 25 years old, it takes on a more sort of what you'd call it, maybe sort of a claret taste. It's almost like a fine Bordeaux. But I really like Zinfandel right kind of, I'd say anywhere this old vine's in, maybe 8 years from the vintage to 12 years from the vintage. So you get some nice complexity from aging in the bottle, but you still have some youthful fruit in there as well.
All right, well now it's question time, right? So we have a couple of things. One is from Lee and Eugenia. They were asking about that you were talking about harvest time. So what is the difference in harvest time for Zin compared to the Petite Zin, for example?
Good question, Lee and Eugenia. Looks nice and sunny where you are right now. So for the Petite Zin, we do harvest earlier. There have been times in the past where we just kind of pulled some juice off of picks where we had picked Zinfandel for making red wine and drained some juice off early so it didn't get a lot of color. But I really kind of like picking some red fruit just for making rosé. I think you get a little bit better, a more balanced wine that way. So we tend to pick it earlier. A lot of our fruit in the last few vintages for our Petite Zin has come from Bogenson Ranch. It's near Bradford Mountain, north of us, and this really high elevation, rocky vineyard, really beautiful vineyard. They've got a few patches there that have a lot of trees surrounding them though, so they don't get a lot of light, and the bunches do tend to be lighter in color. So we really zeroed in on those as well for making rosé. And usually the rosé we're shooting for maybe 22, 23 bricks, whereas Zinfandel is typically going to be more in the 25 to 26 bricks range. And when I say bricks, that's most of you probably know this, but it's a scale of measuring sugar. So it's basically like a percentage based on weight of sugar. So when I say 22 bricks, it's about 22% sugar.
Okay, and so Lori was actually wondering, or Laura, excuse me, was asking, can you blind taste the difference of an old vine Zinfandel? What are you looking for to be able to tell the difference?
I'm not going to tell you that I necessarily could say, this is old vine and this is young vine. A little bit too much of a parlor trick for me, but I would admire someone who could do that. But I do think that I tend to sometimes get a little bit more spice character in the old vine. And often if you had the same vintage, this is an idea for a tasting, Sarah. We tasted our heritage vine and an old vine side by side in the same vintage. The old vine, the heritage vine has this really bright fruit, tends to be, a little bit more jump out of the glass kind of fruit aromas. But the old vine, I feel like has a little more depth and complexity. And so, if you were tasting within the same wineries where you had sort of maybe removing the variable of style a little bit, you might be able to pick out the old vine versus a younger vine wine based on that extra depth and complexity.
Great. So Andrew was noticing that he only sees Zinfandel from California. Is it grown anywhere else?
It is. I I do believe I've encountered a tiny bit of it in Southern Oregon, maybe kind of like the Rogue Valley. Trying to think of where else. I mean, they probably have a little bit in Washington State. I think they, they ought to be able to grow it there, but it's not something that they've really staked their reputation on. But aside from that, we do know Zinfandel is grown other parts of the world. I mean, it is a European grape variety, and you'll certainly find it in Italy, especially the Puglia region, which I'm probably butchering that name, but also in other parts of Eastern Europe, your own Croatia and so forth. That was, as many of you probably have heard, it was kind of a real detective story there, figuring out where did Zinfandel come from. We knew that it was in Italy and they called it Primitivo. And people originally thought Primitivo was a different variety from Zinfandel, but one of my old professors from UC Davis, Carol Meredith, she and her team did some DNA testing and figured out Primitivo and Zinfandel are the same variety, and eventually tracked it down to somewhere around Croatia. And they've got some really hard to pronounce names for it there too.
All right. So then, Marie was wondering, when you refer to oak, do you mean casks or barrels? Is that what you're talking about when you're talking about the different oak? So maybe touch on your barrel program for Zinfandels.
Yes, absolutely. So that is what we mean. We mean oak barrels. So typical oak barrel is just a shade under, excuse me, 60 gallons in size. And you can't see it. Well, maybe if you can see it in the mirror behind me, I'm surrounded by barrels right now. I'm sitting in the cellar. And, an oak barrel is just a really beautiful vessel for aging wine. It allows just the right amount of oxygen into the wine slowly through the wood. We want, a little bit, just not too much, not too little. That's what helps mature the wine. And then the oak itself adds some really interesting flavors. And on top of that, we've got just this amazing amount of research that's gone into toasting a barrel and what different flavor compounds come out of that. And, there's more use of high tech now where some of these coopers that make barrels can use infrared technology to test the heat, and they'll raise the heat of their fire that toasts it or lower it to get different flavors, get different depth of toasting within the wood, and really can get a variety of flavors in a wine. So anything from really charry, like a bourbon barrel, to some really subtle, beautiful, notes like spice and even, slightly green notes that might be interesting in a wine. So long-winded answer. I could go on forever about barrels. I love talking about it. It's such a fascinating subject, but it's that's what we're talking about when I talk about oak, and it's how we age the Zin.
Perfect. So then Mick was asking, are there any particular challenges in working with old vines in particular?
Yeah, there's several. So one thing is that just the different varieties that you have mixed in there are not totally even ripening, and I don't know. I just feel like a lot of these old vine vineyards, they're planted in a lot of times in unique spots where they don't have sort of even ripening within the vineyard. So you kind of have to pick and choose, and you might pick certain sections. Beeson Ranch that we talked about, we usually do 2 to 3 picks there every year. Actually, yeah, at least 3. Maybe even 4 if you count, you count the Petit Syrah as a separate pick, because it's on different elevations, and then some of it's south facing and some of it's north facing slopes. So it's really a challenge kind of to just even to sample it, and then let alone figure out how to divide up the picking. Yeah, it is kind of a challenge to work with, versus younger vines. There may be a little bit less uniformity in ripening, and typically you'll have some vines that are really healthy and big, and they just, they got lots of growth and lots of fruit. And then you've got some other vines that are kind of just hanging in there, and they've got 5 bunches on them, So for me, the trick is really figuring out when you think you've got sort of the right ripeness level across the whole vineyard, because this vine over here with 5 bunches is going to be super ripe, and that one with 25 bunches on it is going to be a lot less ripe and in a much different state.
Perfect. So just a couple more questions. I know we're kind of nearing the end of our time. Chris asked probably one of my favorite questions that I'm eagerly waiting to hear your answer about. What impact does a winemaker have on a great wine?
Oh, tremendous impact. um, well, you know, it really does start in the vineyard. You want great fruit, and you know, then people will sometimes say, okay, just don't screw it up. Well, that's true, but there's a really infinite variety of ways to screw it up. So it does take some talent and training, and and then you have to have a vision for style. So you know what you want, how how you shape that in the vineyard. You know, things like how much fruit do you leave on the vine, or how much do you thin off early in the process so you get the right balance. How much light do you want on the fruit? So managing the canopy. You know, how the irrigation, if it's an irrigated vineyard, really can influence the flavors as well. So all of that is part of what I, as a winemaker, will have some input on the wine, and every winemaker, hopefully. And that's the thing too about working with longtime grower partners like we do, where we're not buying different fruit on the spot market all the time, is that we have a consistency. I know those vineyards. I know how they're going to react. You know, like right now, you know, this heat wave is coming on, going, oh man, I better get up to the Forkini and Bogenson really soon to sample, because they're our earliest Zinfandel, and I can just, you know, sense a disturbance in the forest that the growers are saying, we got to pick. So all that stuff is part of a winemaker's influence, and then all the decisions you make. So, you know, like the barrels, for example, that's a really key decision for me, choosing which barrels and what kind of toast, which cooperage, because every cooper has their own style. It all adds this subtle flavor imprint on the wines. And, you know, and then the end process, blending. You know, I like to do trial blending, tasting blends blind, so I don't know what they are. I don't want to be influenced by my preconceived ideas. And I really feel like being very meticulous in that process is part of the key that's helped me make some really nice wines.
Great. Well, you've talked a lot about blending. So David Wallace was asking, really, can you talk about making Zin as a single varietal, as in 100% Zinfandel? So maybe why or why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really, for me, it's difficult to make a Zinfandel that's 100% Zinfandel and feel satisfied with it. I just like a little more richness and depth in Zinfandel that you get from some Petit Syrah, typically, or something like Alicante Bouschet, perhaps. But Petit Syrah is really kind of the go-to blender for Zin. If you do 100% Zinfandel, you are going to have a lighter style wine, and you know, that's just a stylistic choice then, right? So I have tasted some Zinfandels that are 100% Zinfandel, and they're beautiful wines, and I really like them. And I like that they're a different style from the ones that I make. So I'm not drinking something that's just like I made, and it's, you know, variety is kind of the spice of life, right? So, but for me, it can be a little bit lacking if you don't have at least a little bit of something else blended with it, and you know, just maybe a little less complexity. So it takes a really unusual vineyard, I think, to make just 100% Zinfandel wine, and it's one of the reasons those old vine field blend vineyards are so great, I think, because you get Zinfandel and some other varieties. You know, you get a blend already built into it.
So Tim, what happens to the vines in an old vine vineyard when they have to come out? If there's a vine that's diseased, or how do they replant? Do they replant? How do they choose? Can we speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So, you know, we talk about the age of these vineyards, and the fact is we refer to when the vineyard was planted, but we don't know that every vine there is an original, and they probably aren't. You know, even though, you know, some of these vines can live to a really ripe age, eventually something's going to happen. You know, they get some virus. Sometimes we joke about something called tractor blight, which is when a tractor knocks over a vine, and it's that spells curtains for the vine. But so if you want to keep the vineyard going, you're going to have to go through some cycles of replants. Beeson Ranch, again, is a good example of that, where in the last few years, they have done some replants. They kind of put a pause in that for a little while because it takes a lot of care to sort of nurse these young vines in a dry farm vineyard, nurse them up and get them producing. But if you want to keep the vineyard going, you really do want to keep replanting. And then, we know that you still got plenty of old vines out there. It's got a lot of character. And personally, I really encourage these vineyard owners to include some non-Zinfandel replants in there as well. They don't always listen to me, but I really think it's important to keep a little bit of that character of their vineyard going with something else. So maybe take some cuttings from some of the Grenache or the Mourvedre or whatever you've got in the vineyard.
So how long would you recommend cellaring these particular old vines and Zinfandels? That was a question from Mick.
Yeah, I'm going to, as by way of answering that, use that as an excuse to go back and taste the 2016 real quick. Like the 2016, I really feel like if you've got good cellar conditions, so you're looking at somewhere between 55 to 58 degrees, maybe 60 degrees at the upper end, and not much in the way of temperature fluctuation, at least 5 more years, maybe a little bit longer. Like I said, I tend to like a little bit of youthful fruit still in the wine. But if you like a little bit more maturity in the wine, then you might go as long as 8, maybe even 10 years with that. 2017, so let's taste that again. Yeah, that's got some good structure, some good tannin. So I think with that one, I'd feel good about saying up to 8 years maybe. And if you're aging wine too, one of the really fun things is if you are lucky enough to be able to afford it, if you can get several bottles of wine, maybe anywhere from 3 to 6 or even a case, you can taste it at different intervals through its life, and that's part of the fun, is seeing how it's aging. So I'm going to taste the 2018 now. Yeah,
it looks like Chris and Jean have a 2012 in their cellar. They're wondering if they should drink it now.
When I come over, you can drink it, sure. No, I probably would think about popping that one open, somewhere in the next couple of years. So the 2018, again, I feel like it's got some really good structure. So I would say 8 to 10 years at least for that one as well.
Okay, so we have one last question, and we'll let you all go to your evening. Andrew was wondering, you were talking about barrels and how, and I know you can go on for a long time with barrels, but he was wondering your thoughts on the trend of the bourbon barrels. Is that a fad or a gimmick, or do you think that it actually would impart some qualities?
Well, I do look at it as a fad, maybe a little bit of a gimmick. Personally, I don't care for that. One of the, bourbon barrels are made from American oak, and American coopers started out making whiskey barrels, among other things. But, for any beverage, that was what they did. And a whiskey barrel has a very high temperature, short time toast that just basically turns the inside of the barrel to charcoal. And in fact, a lot of times it's actually on fire. The barrel's on fire for a few seconds and then they put it out. To me, I just don't like that really charry flavor. But also with wine, when you have that really fast toast where you just kind of sear the outside, but you don't get toasting deeper into the wood, deeper penetration into the wood, it doesn't have some of the beautiful flavors that I like from oak. Some people have really liked the bourbon aged wines and bourbon barrel aged wines, and I've even had, I think, a beer that was okay. It was pretty good, but that's just not the direction I want to go with barrels.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining us. If I didn't get your question, I tried to get them all, but if I didn't, please don't hesitate to reach out. Oh, Andrew, I know, I love the waves. It's so good to see all of your faces. If you loved this vertical set, I hate to tell you that we do not have any more to sell to you at the moment. However, A little bird might whisper in your ear that it will be making an appearance at the holidays. So if it's something that you might want for yourself, or you might want to give it to someone else as a gift set, I encourage you to act early as soon as you see that holiday email come through. There will be a limited amount of those Old Vine verticals. And then if you had fun with us tonight, I would encourage you to sign up for our next tasting, which I'm very excited to announce is a partnership with a local chocolate purveyor, Volo Chocolate. And so we will be doing a 4-bottle Bordeaux tasting with a 6-bar chocolate pairing of artisanal chocolate. So that's up on our website now. You'll be getting an email soon about it. So I'd encourage you to check out that delicious tasting. And of course, if you're not part of our wine club, make sure that you can sign up so that you can enjoy club member benefits. So you can get all of these things at club member savings. So thank you again so much. We just love seeing your faces. Thank you for the questions. It's so great to see you all. I hope you're all staying safe, and we hope we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is great fun. This is one of the best attended tastings. I love it. And I have to say it was the first one where I had some family members. So my wife and daughter are out there, my sister-in-law, Sue. Great to see all of you. And great to see a lot of old friends out there as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks a lot.
everyone.
Appreciate it.